So the Netherlands has officially shut down 3,000 farms. This is in reaction to their mandate to reduce nitrogen emissions specifically by 2030 by 50%. This is both the EU and the WEF working together to help combat climate change. Now, I'm not going to speak much to the politics behind this, but what I am going to speak to is how it's going to ultimately affect you and whether this will or will not cause food costs to rise, and specifically what food costs will rise because of this. What I will say is that I work in agriculture, my family farms, and let's just say this channel that teaches you how to garden, you may want to capitalize on some of those videos right now, get your seeds, and start learning. So I think one of the first things that we need to look at if we're going to analyze how the shutdown of 3,000 farms is going to affect the world in regards to feeding it, not so much how it's going to affect the world in regards to climate change, but feeding people, we need to look at what a farm, a single farm, looks like in size in the Netherlands. Now, when we look at farms in Canada and the US, we think thousands of acres minimum per farm. But in the Netherlands, it's much different. It's more communal and small. So ultimately, a single farm on average in the Netherlands is just less than 42 hectares. 42 hectares isn't a ton of land, but to put it into perspective, a hectare does feed approximately 5 people for an entire year. So 42 hectares total, you can see how many people that ultimately would feed in the world. And then if we, multiply that by 3,000, we can see how many more people that will feed. Now, one thing I will say when speaking to the politics is the sounds of this is that it's forced. It's not an option to just say, listen, I don't want my farm bought. It's something that has to happen. You will not be able to say no to this whole thing. So that is something to keep in mind. So if we look at how many people on average it feeds, we then need to actually look at how many of the 3,000 farms, each one of which is around 42 hectares, what do they produce? What are they exporting to the world? And what are they keeping to themselves? You have to keep in mind that when something gets shut down and industry gets throttled, we have two sides of a coin. We have the exports going out to feed the world, but then we also have the population within Netherlands that was self-sustaining itself, maybe to a point on certain goods and services from an agricultural perspective, that no longer will be able to because they have a void in which they're not able to provide. So it's kind of a two-way street. But I think for us, we should mostly look at the exports just to get an idea or a snapshot of what kind of effect it's going to have on the world. So the first thing I wanted to look at was, what does the Netherlands produce? And the Netherlands is a top producer of wheat, silage, potatoes in particular, but a majority of that used to stay inside of the Netherlands. So that was actually used in a large part to feed the meat industry and the dairy industry, which are huge in the Netherlands. So the silage, the corn, potatoes, that sort of thing, while some of it is exported, majority of it would have been kept internally and used internally to feed their population with the meat and the dairy, and then exporting the excess. Now, with that being said, when we look at exports from Netherlands, the first one, number one, by a long shot, is ornamental flowers. So is this going to affect your food bill? No, but it is going to affect the cost of the fancy, beautiful tulips that you typically like to purchase in the spring. So business idea for Canadians and Americans out there, or a flower farm, an at-home DIY flower farm. It is a great choice right now, just based on how much of an export this is when it comes to agriculture. Number two position is meat. Now, I would argue that Canada and the US, and when we actually look at the stats or the destinations for agricultural exports out of the Netherlands, North America is pretty far down on the list, only because some of this stuff just simply is not going to travel well across seas. Countries that may be concerned with this would be Germany, Belgium, France, and the UK. These are the top 4 countries that export things like the meat and the dairy from Netherlands. So you can expect your costs to go up because you're ultimately shutting down a massive part of that industry. So after that, after meat and ornamental flowers, we have, or their third highest export is dairy and eggs. So again, that's something that may be transported over to Canada and the US in the specialty departments, particularly for the dairy portion, cheese and that sort of thing. But for the most part, that's going into the EU, not so much Canada and the US. After that, they get into vegetables and fruit. This is an export, but I would also assume a lot of this is consumed at home, natively, inside of the Netherlands. So I could see it affecting the prices outside of the Netherlands, but I could see it actually really affecting more so those in the Netherlands more than anything. And then after that, things like fat, so oils produced by plants, wheat, cereals, that sort of thing, they are kind of all equal in export amount. And again, they wouldn't be exporting much of this. I could see a lot of this being used to feed that meat industry, which is their second highest export, and that dairy industry, which is their third highest export. Now, what I will say is that the Netherlands is in quite a bit of turmoil because of this. They have had protests from the farmers themselves and then obviously the people that supported them. We saw a little bit of a spillover of that into Canada. I think that was in reaction to the emissions targets that was put out to farmers in regards to nitrogen, but ultimately their agricultural minister resigned due to this whole thing, and it's a big deal. People are upset about it. People who maybe aren't connected to the agricultural industry can see the writing on the walls for what's going to drive up costs or how it's going to affect them, but they haven't seen it yet. I think that people, for the most part, in the upcoming weeks are going to just say, boo-hoo, sucks to be you, to a lot of the farmers, which is unfortunate. And when they're going to start to care is when it's going to really affect their pocketbook, and in particular the meats, the dairies, and those exports for the European Union. So it's an unfortunate situation. There's nothing that these farmers can do. There are things you can do, like growing a garden and growing your own fruits and vegetables. I wouldn't expect you to own a dairy cow in the city because that would be illegal, but there are things you can do to just reduce the grocery bill as a whole. As things like cheese or dairy go up in price, you can have more money just because you're not buying the fruits and vegetables because you are canning or you're growing your own lettuce indoors, whatever the case is. So these are all things to consider. You may just need to allocate funds differently based on that. And keep in mind, there are ways to store cheese in particular long term. I have a second channel, this Homesteading Canada. I'm going to start posting more on that, I swear. But one thing you can do is waxing of cheese. So just waxing regular cheese now because it'll store for 25 years. And that's just small ways that you can try to cushion yourself against inflation. Obviously, there's much more high-tech ways like freeze drying and that sort of thing. I don't own a freeze dryer, so I can't even, comment on what that looks like. But yeah, it's ultimately going to affect you. Maybe not the US and Canada as much. I don't think it's going to affect the US and Canada as much, but the EU for sure is going to get hit with this. But with that being said, there are emissions targets coming out for Canada, and so you can see how that's going to affect us. But ultimately, if you guys want more updates on this story as it progresses, or as I hear more, let me know in the comments down below, and I'd be happy to jump in on them. Talk to you later. Bye.